is Autopilot. Autopilot Systems by Reagan Lee. A brief history of autopilot systems. They were founded in 1912 by this guy, Matthew Sperry. It was just 9 years after the first controlled flight completed by the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk. It was initially designed just to automate the balancing of the aircraft because that used to be done manually with levers and gadgets and gizmos. It was initially known not as an autopilot, but a gyroscopic automatic pilot, and many pilots called it George, which I was unable to determine an origin for. Since Genesis, autopilot has been designed to relieve pilots of mundane tasks in order to tedious mundane tasks in order to focus attention on other controls, such as your more advanced systems that have been developed over time. It also relieves the stress on the pilots, which can allow them to fly for longer. Initially, in the 1950s, commercial flights required a radio operator, they required a flight engineer, they required 2 pilots, and they required a radio operator. Now, and since the 1990s, they only need 2 pilots. Airbus was the first to bring a fly-by-wire system to the commercial market with the Airbus A320. And then Boeing followed in 1990 with their own fly-by-wire system. The primary components of autopilot consist of multiple computers, one which performs comparisons between the current state of flight and the course input that was put into the computer by the pilot before takeoff, comparing the way it's going and the way it should be going. And a second computer interprets the data and sends signals to all the motors which control the different actions of the plane, all the control surfaces, ailerons, flaps, rudder, etc., and move them around in order to ensure that the flight is on track. There are sensors, and they're very important because they are the ones who provide all the data to the computers, and the computers provide all the data to the motors. However, the sensors are really what keep everything going because the data points are what the computer processes. Examples include barometers, gyroscopes, your pitot tube, your static port, all the things which collect data which normal instruments would use are used by the autopilot system as sort of their own gauges in a way. And those are very important, and they allow everything else to work in order to keep the plane going where it's supposed to go. And in regards to training, there is no training. It's very recommended, but there is no official FAA sanctioned autopilot pilot certification or rating or anything like that. You definitely should learn about it though before touching all the random buttons on the dash. Even the fancier autopilots, the 2-axis autopilots, are a portion of technically advanced aircraft, and technically advanced aircraft are a set of attributes of an aircraft that make it technically advanced, and even those don't require any extra training from the FAA. So you definitely don't need any for like a single axis one, which is kind of crappy autopilot, but it's still autopilot. But you definitely should try to learn about it and learn what the buttons do before you mess with it while in the air. And it's very important to know that autopilots are like slaves, and they will do whatever you tell them to do, even if it's very, very bad. So if they if you enter a misinput, the plane's going to follow that misinput. So say you told it to drop, and instead you accidentally told it to rise. It will rise, which may not be the end of the world. But what if you told it to rise? If you meant to tell it to rise, and you accidentally told it to drop? This is Lion Air Flight 610, and it crashed into the Sea of Jakarta. It's possible that this was also just a malfunction, because autopilot systems do malfunction. That's why it's important to always keep an eye out on your autopilot system and not to rely on it, because relying on it opens you up to suffering the weight of the sins of the autopilot system. And you would hate to do that. So that's why it's important, like car cruise control. You always need to make sure your car isn't going to go into another car. You need to make sure your plane doesn't go into the sea. And it's important to maintain your skills as a pilot and always have the ability to manually take control of the flight and ensure that in the event of an error, whether human or mechanical, that it's dealt with. And those are autopilot systems. And that's the end of the PowerPoint. And I hope you enjoyed this training session. And if you are interested in autopilots, there's a lot of information.